Welcome everyone. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like and subscribe to the channel. And also where you from and what time are you watching? Tell us in the comment. It started with an invitation. A thick, black envelope arrived at 6 different doorsteps, each sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. A faceless mask with hollow eyes. The message inside was written in elegant, gold-embossed lettering. You are cordially invited to an exclusive masquerade at Blackwood Manor. A night of mystery, indulgence, and revelation awaits. Carriages will arrive at dusk. No sender, no explanation, just an address. 6 people, strangers to one another, held the same invitation in their hands, each hesitating for different reasons. But curiosity is a powerful force, and in the end, it was far stronger than fear. The road to Blackwood Manor was long, winding through dense, skeletal trees that clawed at the darkening sky. Rain drizzled against the carriage windows, distorting the outline of the mansion atop the hill, a Gothic structure too grand to be abandoned, yet too ominous to be welcoming. When the gates creaked open on their own, not a single driver hesitated. They had done their job. Whatever happened next was no longer their concern. One by one, the guests stepped out, their eyes rising toward the towering estate. The mansion was unnervingly silent, its countless windows like hollow sockets staring down at them. The lanterns at the entrance flickered as though struggling against the wind, but the air was dead still. A butler, clad in an old-fashioned uniform and a plain white mask, stood at the entrance. He said nothing, simply gestured them inside. As each guest entered the grand foyer, the heavy doors swung shut behind them on their own. The echo of the latch clicking into place sent a shiver through the room. They were trapped. The grand ballroom was unlike anything they had ever seen. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, casting ghostly reflections on the polished marble floor. The walls were lined with masks, hundreds of them, unnervingly lifelike, their glassy eyes following the guests as they moved. They gathered near a lavishly set dining table, each guest studying the others in cautious silence. Eleanor, the journalist, her sharp eyes scanning every detail, searching for the story hidden beneath the extravagance. Dylan, the washed-up actor, drowning his unease in a glass of whiskey, already regretting his decision to come. Victoria, the socialite, composed and poised, though her fingers tightened around her champagne flute. Marcus, the businessman, his jaw tense, his presence exuding the weight of a secret. Nina, the artist, her gaze lingering on the masks, unsettled by something she couldn't quite name. Ethan, the enigma, too quiet, too observant, his expression unreadable. As the clock chimed 8, the butler stepped forward. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," he announced. "Your host will arrive shortly. Please, enjoy the festivities." The words felt rehearsed, hollow, and then the lights flickered. For a single, dreadful second, the chandeliers dimmed to nothing. The room was swallowed in darkness. When the lights returned, someone stood at the head of the table. A tall figure, clad in black, wearing a smooth, featureless mask. A shiver crawled up their spines. "Tonight, we celebrate not only mystery, but truth," the host said, their voice distorted, layered, as if multiple voices spoke at once. "By the end of this evening, each of you will see yourselves for who you truly are." Dinner was served. Conversation was minimal, the tension in the room a living thing. Eleanor leaned toward Nina. "Did you notice the masks?" she whispered. Nina nodded. "They're too realistic, like they were made from—" She hesitated. "Real faces." Eleanor's stomach tightened. She had been in too many crime scenes, seen too many horrors. There was something off about this place. Then the first scream echoed through the mansion. Victoria had excused herself to the powder room 15 minutes ago. She hadn't come back. Dylan chuckled nervously. Maybe she got lost. This place is a damn labyrinth. I'll check on her, Eleanor said, pushing her chair back. She moved through the dimly lit corridors, past the ancient portraits staring down at her. A cold draft whispered through the hallway, sending an unnatural chill through her spine. The door to the powder room was slightly ajar. "Victoria?" Eleanor called. No answer. She pushed the door open. The room was empty, except for Victoria's mask lying on the marble floor, streaked with something dark and wet. A rustling sound made her whip around, but the hallway was empty. Or was it? Somewhere in the darkness, something was breathing. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She grabbed the mask, her fingers trembling, and then, behind her, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. She turned and came face to face with Victoria, or what looked like her. The guests turned as Eleanor entered the ballroom, breathless, and Victoria followed. The tension melted into relief. "Oh, there you are," Dylan laughed. "We were about to send a search party." But Eleanor didn't move. Neither did Nina. Something was wrong. Victoria stood there, motionless, too still. Her movements were stiff, her face too perfect, like her skin was stretched too tightly. Her eyes were empty. Eleanor's mouth went dry. "That's not her." The laughter died. "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "She wasn't there," Eleanor whispered. "Her mask was on the floor, and then she just appeared." Victoria's lips curled into an eerie, unnatural smile. "I was here the whole time," she said. Nina gasped. Her voice. It was almost right, but not quite. Then Victoria's head tilted too far, like her neck had no bones. And she whispered, "Who are you when your face is gone?" The candlelight flickered violently. And then she lunged at them. Chaos erupted. Victoria moved too fast, her body jerking like a puppet with cut strings. She grabbed Dylan, slamming him against the table with unnatural strength. "Get her off!" Dylan screamed. Ethan lunged forward, trying to pull her away, but she turned too quickly, her hand slicing across his arm with something razor-sharp. Blood splattered the tablecloth. Marcus grabbed a chair and swung it, but Victoria twisted her body impossibly, dodging it with inhuman flexibility. Dylan gasped, clutching his throat. Blood poured between his fingers. Victoria stepped back, tilting her head, her skin splitting at the edges as if the face wasn't hers. And then, with a sickening, wet-tearing sound, she peeled it away. The guest screamed. Beneath the mask of flesh was a blank, featureless face, smooth as porcelain. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. But it laughed. The voice came from everywhere at once. "Who's next?" The chandelier shattered, plunging the room into darkness. And the real massacre began. Darkness swallowed the ballroom. The last image seared into their minds was Victoria peeling away her face, revealing something horribly blank underneath. Then the chandelier shattered. The world was thrown into chaos. Eleanor hit the ground hard, crawling beneath the long dining table as splinters and glass rained down. She could hear Dylan choking, gurgling on his own blood. Someone was sobbing. The floorboards creaked. Footsteps. The thing that had once been Victoria was moving. Eleanor held her breath, and then a hand clamped onto her ankle. She screamed. Darkness swallowed the ballroom. The last image seared into their minds was Victoria peeling away her face, revealing something horribly blank underneath. Then the chandelier shattered. The world was thrown into chaos. Eleanor hit the ground hard, crawling beneath the long dining table as splinters and glass rained down. She could hear Dylan choking, gurgling on his own blood. Someone was sobbing. The floorboards creaked. Footsteps. The thing that had once been Victoria was moving. Eleanor held her breath, and then a hand clamped onto her ankle. She screamed and kicked wildly, her heel striking something soft and wet. A sickening squelch followed, and the grip loosened. Through the dim light, she saw Dylan writhing on the floor, clutching his throat, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes locked onto hers, wide and desperate. Eleanor scrambled forward, pressing her hands against his neck, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me," she whispered. But Dylan's eyes lost focus, his lips mouthing silent words before his body went still. A cold dread settled in Eleanor's stomach. A wet tearing sound echoed through the room. She turned and saw it kneeling over Dylan's body. It peeled away his face, lifting the dripping flesh like a mask, revealing that horrifying blank visage underneath. Then, the thing placed Dylan's face over its own. It shifted, contorting unnaturally. The flesh melted into place, reshaping itself. And when it stood up, it was Dylan. But not really. His eyes were glassy, his movements slightly off, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Eleanor stumbled backward while rising in her throat. "Dylan?" Nina's voice was barely above a whisper. The thing smiled, but the expression was too perfect, too practiced. "I was here the whole time," it said. A chilling déjà vu washed over Eleanor. It had said the same thing when Victoria returned. She grabbed Nina's wrist. "We have to go." Eleanor and Nina ran through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the vast, endless hallways. Somewhere behind them, they heard Marcus shouting. Eleanor pulled Nina around a corner, pressing their backs against the wall. "That thing?" Nina gasped, clutching her chest. It wore his face." Eleanor pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to think. "It's not just killing us. It's becoming us." A realization hit her like ice water. That means Dylan. The real Dylan is gone. Nina's lip trembled. A piercing scream tore through the mansion. "Marcus." Eleanor grabbed a decorative candle holder from the wall and sprinted toward the sound. She burst into a study, and her stomach dropped. Marcus was pinned against a bookshelf, his arms held down by an inhuman strength. Over him stood another version of Marcus. The real Marcus thrashed violently, kicking and struggling. The imposter slowly, painfully, dug its fingers into Marcus's cheeks, its nails carving into his skin. Marcus screamed as his face peeled away in one smooth motion. The thing lifted the mask of flesh and placed it over its blank face. Nina gagged. "Oh my God!" The new Marcus turned to them. "I was here the whole time," it whispered. Eleanor hurled the candle holder, striking the imposter in the face. The force knocked it backward, giving them just enough time to grab the real Marcus and run. But as they fled, doors began slamming shut one by one, trapping them in an endless labyrinth of hallways. There was no way out. Nina yanked Eleanor's sleeve, pointing to an old wooden door near the end of the hall. "There!" They threw it open, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase leading downward. It reeked of damp stone and something rotten, but they had no other choice. The three of them descended into the dark. The air grew colder. The shadows pressed against them. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the walls were breathing. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a massive underground chamber, and in the center a table covered in masks. Not ordinary masks, faces, hundreds of them, lifelike, preserved, staring. Nina's breath hitched. "These are the others." Eleanor picked one up with shaking hands. Felt soft, real, human. "Who are you when your face is gone?" The whisper came from nowhere. Then footsteps. The thing that had taken Marcus's face was standing at the top of the stairs, watching them. Tilted its head, then stepped forward. Then another set of footsteps. And another. More of them. Victoria, Dylan, Marcus. All of them blank-faced horrors now. Their stolen flesh molded over their eerie, unnatural forms. Nina backed away. "We're trapped." Eleanor's mind raced. There had to be a way out. She scanned the room and then she saw it. A single mask on a pedestal unlike the others. It was featureless. A perfectly smooth face. She knew it was important. And somehow she knew what she had to do. She reached for it and everything went black. Eleanor awoke alone. The basement was gone. The masks were gone. She was standing in the grand ballroom, but the chandeliers were dark, the walls warped and shifting. A figure stood before her. The host, still wearing that perfect, featureless mask. "Who are you?" Eleanor whispered. The figure removed the mask, and beneath it was Eleanor's own face. She staggered backward, heart pounding. "This isn't real," she gasped. The doppelganger smiled. "Isn't it?" The shadows swirled around her. Memories flashed through her mind, but they weren't hers. The invitations, the masked butler, the house that never let them leave. And then the final, most horrifying truth struck her. There was no original killer. The cycle never started. It only continued. Each victim who lost their face became the next hunter. Because in this house, only one person could leave. And they could only escape by taking someone else's face. Eleanor's breath trembled. "You have a choice," the doppelganger whispered. "Kill and take a new face to escape." The mask appeared in her hands. "Or be erased forever." Eleanor stood there, paralyzed. She saw Nina in the distance, looking for her. Still alive. Her grip on the mask tightened. If she took it, she could escape. She could be free. But that meant she had to steal someone else's face. The doppelganger tilted its head. "Choose." Nina turned, her eyes lit up in relief. "Eleanor." Tears stung Eleanor's eyes. And she whispered, "I'm sorry." The mask latched onto her face. Nina's scream was the last thing she heard. The next morning, a single survivor was found wandering near the gates of Blackwood Manor. She was shaken, crying, bloodstained. She called herself Eleanor. She told the authorities that something terrible had happened in the mansion. She was the only one left. They took her away, gave her new clothes, new identification. The past didn't matter. She was free. But that night, in the reflection of her hotel mirror, her face twitched unnaturally. And in her own voice, but not quite right, she whispered, "I was here the whole time." Morning light bled through the windows of the small police station on the outskirts of town. Eleanor sat on a stiff chair, wrapped in a thin blanket, her hands still trembling. A steaming cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her. A detective, Officer Green, sat across from her, studying her with quiet suspicion. "You're telling me 6 people went into that mansion last night and you're the only one who made it out?" Eleanor nodded, her voice raw. "It was a massacre." She swallowed hard. "I don't know what happened. People just disappeared." Officer Green exhaled, scribbling something in his notepad. "And the host? The one who sent the invitations?" Eleanor shook her head. "I never saw his face." Her voice was too calm, too measured. Officer Green frowned. He'd worked enough cases to know when someone was holding something back. But before he could press her further, a younger officer knocked on the door, his face pale. "Sir, we checked the mansion." Green turned. "And?" The officer hesitated. "There's nothing there." Green frowned. "What do you mean, nothing?" "The mansion is abandoned. Completely empty. No signs of a party. No bodies. No blood. Just dust and cobwebs." Green slowly turned back to Eleanor. Her fingers gripped the blanket a little tighter. "That's impossible," she whispered. But something cold and knowing flickered in her eyes. And Green saw it. That night, Eleanor sat in a hotel room staring at her reflection. It was her face. Wasn't it? She pressed her fingers against her cheeks. Her skin felt normal. Her breath came in slow, measured gasps. But deep inside, something felt off. Like a voice whispering at the edges of her mind. A memory surfaced, the mask latching onto her face. The screams of Nina. The whisper in her own voice, but not quite hers. "I was here the whole time." Eleanor's breath hitched. Slowly, she lifted a hand to her face. And pushed. Her skin shifted beneath her fingertips. Not like flesh. Like fabric. Like a mask. She gasped and stumbled back, heart hammering. "No, no, no, no." She clawed at her face, pressing her nails into her cheeks, but it didn't peel away. It didn't come off. It had become her. Or rather, she had become it. Eleanor stared at the mirror, her reflection distorting. The face looking back at her was still her own. But something about it was too perfect. She smiled. Her reflection smiled a second later. A delayed, glitching mimicry. Her chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, too steady. Too controlled. Like something imitating human behavior. A tremor ran through her body. She remembered. She remembered choosing to live. To take a new face. But now, she wasn't sure if she had ever really existed at all. The next morning, Eleanor checked out of the hotel. She walked to a quiet cafe, sat down, and sipped at a fresh cup of coffee. A man sat across from her. Marcus. But it wasn't really Marcus. Because Marcus was dead. He smiled at her. I was here the whole time. Eleanor smiled back. Because she knew she had a job to do. That night, 6 invitations were sent out. 6 new guests would arrive at the mansion. And one of them would walk away, wearing a new face. Ethan Holloway was not the type of man who believed in the supernatural. He believed in logic, routine, and predictability. His days were predictable. Wake up, go to work as a systems analyst, return home, eat dinner, and watch mindless television before bed. His girlfriend, Lena, often teased him about how boringly structured he was. You need some excitement in your life, she'd say, rolling her eyes as he meticulously set his alarm for 7 a.m. sharp each night. But Ethan liked predictability. Predictability meant control. That's why the first phone call unsettled him. It shattered the careful structure of his world in the most unexpected way. The night it happened, Ethan had been sleeping soundly when his phone buzzed on his nightstand. His eyes cracked open, irritation flaring. He wasn't expecting a call. He turned over and grabbed his phone. Unknown caller. The time on the screen read 3:33 a.m. Frowning, he debated letting it go to voicemail, but a strange unease crawled over him. Why would someone call him at this hour? A wrong number? An emergency? Against his better judgment, he swiped to answer. Hello? His voice was hoarse with sleep. Silence. Then he heard breathing. Faint. Shallow. Then a voice. His voice. Hello, the voice on the other end said, perfectly in sync with what he had just spoken. Ethan bolted upright in bed, his grip tightening on the phone. His heart began to pound. What the hell? He muttered, but even as he spoke, the voice on the line repeated his words exactly 10 seconds before he said them. It was his voice. Identical. Ethan swallowed hard. Who is this? Who is this? The voice echoed. A chill ran down his spine. He ended the call immediately, his hands clammy against the phone screen. This had to be a prank. Some kind of weird voice recording app. He tossed his phone on the nightstand, trying to ignore the unsettled feeling curling in his gut. It was just a glitch. A coincidence. But the calls would keep coming. And the delay would only get shorter. The next night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., his phone rang again. Unknown caller. Ethan hesitated this time. He didn't want to answer, but something compelled him. He picked up. And again, the voice on the other end spoke 10 seconds before he did. This time, it was more than just an echo. The voice started predicting things before he even thought of saying them. He ran tests. One night, he answered and remained completely silent. Yet the call spoke anyway. Why are you saying anything? The voice asked, perfectly predicting what he was thinking. Ethan's chest tightened. His world, his carefully structured, predictable world, was beginning to crack. You look like you haven't slept in days, Lena commented over dinner a week later. Ethan barely heard her. His mind was drowning in thoughts of the calls. He didn't tell Lena. She'd think he was crazy. Hell, he was starting to think he was crazy. Instead, he mumbled, just work stress. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. Maybe you should take some time off. You seem off. She was right. He felt off. The calls were messing with him, making him second-guess reality. And worst of all, the delay was shrinking. What started as 10 seconds ahead shrank to 9 seconds. Then 8. Then 5. Ethan recorded the calls, analyzing them. The voice on the line, his voice, was speaking sooner and sooner until, terrifyingly, it was only 1 second ahead. A sickening thought clawed at his mind. What happens when the delay reaches 0? And then came the worst night of all. The night the voice spoke before he did, not by seconds, but by entire sentences. The night his own voice gave him a command. A command he had no choice but to obey. It happened at exactly 3:33 a.m. Ethan had been dreading the call, but he couldn't stop himself from answering. His trembling fingers hovered over the screen, then against every rational thought in his head, he picked up. Silence. Then his own voice, speaking before he did. Get up and go to the window. Ethan stiffened. The voice had never issued commands before. It had only repeated him or predicted what he was going to say. But now it was telling him what to do. His pulse pounded. His skin felt like it was crawling. He sat frozen in bed, refusing to move. Then the voice spoke again. "If you don't look, you'll regret it." Something about the way it said those words, so calm, so certain, sent a bolt of fear through him. He found himself swinging his legs over the bed and standing, his body moving as if on autopilot. He walked to the window, hands shaking, and hesitated before peering outside. His apartment complex was quiet. The street below was dimly lit, empty. But then movement. Across the street, a figure stood completely still, bathed in the dull glow of a street lamp. Ethan's breath hitched. The figure was wearing his face. Not just similar, not just a look-alike. It was him. Same tired eyes, same unshaven stubble, same wary expression. And then the other Ethan smiled first. The phone slipped from Ethan's hands. The call disconnected. The next morning, Ethan sat in his living room, clutching a cup of coffee with hands he could barely keep steady. His reflection, the street, the voice. It wasn't possible. It wasn't possible. He needed help. But who would believe him? He thought about telling Lena, but what would he even say? "Hey, babe, I think my own voice is calling me in the middle of the night and controlling my actions." No, he needed answers first. So he started researching. And that's when he found the forum. It was buried deep in the web, a discussion board titled, "The Last 10 Seconds, a Real Phenomenon?" Hundreds of posts. Stories eerily similar to his. People receiving phone calls. Voices predicting their words. The delays shrinking. And then a pinned warning at the top of the page, "Do not let the delay reach 0. If it does, you won't be in control anymore." Ethan's breath hitched. He scrolled frantically, reading post after post. Some people had resisted the calls, blocked the numbers, smashed their phones. But it didn't stop. The calls always found a way. Then one post caught his eye. A user named Eyes Open had written something that made Ethan's stomach churn. "I thought I could beat it. I thought if I stayed silent, I could stop it. But it doesn't matter, because eventually it starts speaking for you." Ethan slammed his laptop shut. His phone buzzed. He didn't look. He already knew what time it was. Ethan had always thought therapy was for other people. But after 2 weeks of sleepless nights, dwindling sanity, and hallucinations of his other self, he had no choice. Dr. Calloway's office was sterile and cold, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a faint scent of leather. Ethan sat stiffly, fingers tapping against his knee. "Tell me everything," the doctor said. So Ethan did. He expected disbelief, a scoff, a recommendation for medication. But Dr. Calloway only frowned, tapping a pen against his notepad. "This isn't the first time I've heard something like this." Ethan blinked. "What?" The doctor hesitated, then pulled out a file. "I had another patient years ago. Similar symptoms. Hearing his own voice in recordings. Predicting his speech before he said it. He was convinced something was controlling him." Ethan leaned forward. "What happened to him?" Dr. Calloway sighed. "He disappeared." Ethan's stomach dropped. "The last time I saw him, he told me the delay had reached 0. That night, Ethan did something reckless. He answered the call at 3:33 a.m. But this time, he was ready. "Who are you?" he demanded. But before the words even left his mouth, the voice on the line spoke first. "You were never in control, Ethan." Ethan's blood turned to ice. His throat tightened and his voice spoke without his consent. "Who are you?" His own voice repeated even though he hadn't intended to say it. His heart pounded. He tried to say something else, anything else. But the voice had already spoken. It was controlling his words now. His own body felt foreign, sluggish. He tried to move, but his hands refused to obey. The delay had reached 0. And Ethan Holloway was no longer the one in control. Ethan's heart pounded. He clenched his fists, willing his mouth to say something, anything that wasn't dictated by the voice on the phone. But the words had already formed. "Who are you?" The question wasn't his. It had been forced from his lips before he even thought of it. A wave of nausea hit him. He tried to move his hands, but they barely twitched. His body felt slow, like it wasn't his anymore. Then the voice in the phone whispered, "You already know." Ethan yanked the phone from his ear and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack. But the call didn't end. From the speaker, his own voice kept talking. "You were never the one speaking. You were just repeating what I allowed you to say." Ethan stumbled backward, his breath ragged. No, this isn't real." He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the sides of his head. But when he opened them, his reflection in the window was still smiling. He wasn't smiling, but his reflection was. And then it spoke. "It's time to switch places." Ethan scrambled backward, his limbs sluggish, his vision blurring. The reflection moved toward him. No, not the reflection. It was stepping out. Like peeling skin from flesh, the glass distorted as the other Ethan emerged, pulling itself free from the window's surface. It looked exactly like him. Same tired eyes, same stubble. But the smile, asterisk, that awful, knowing smile, asterisk, never wavered. The phone on the floor crackled with static. Then his voice whispered, "It's done." Ethan gasped because at that moment he felt his entire body go numb. His vision tunneled, darkness creeping in at the edges. His limbs felt weightless. And then everything shifted. Ethan blinked. The world had flipped. He was still in his apartment. But something was wrong. The air felt thinner. The colors were muted. The lights buzzed too loudly. And then he realized he was in the reflection. His movements were delayed like a slow-loading video. He raised a hand, but it didn't respond until a second later. Through the glass, he saw the other Ethan standing in the real world. And the worst part? Lena was walking into the room. She smiled at the other Ethan, completely unaware. "Hey, babe. Couldn't sleep again?" Ethan tried to scream, tried to pound against the glass, but no sound came out. The thing wearing his face turned to the mirror. And for the first time, Ethan saw it for what it really was. Not a person. Not even a copy. Just a hollow thing wearing his skin. It smiled wider. And then it turned away, leaving Ethan trapped forever. Days passed. Maybe weeks. Ethan watched from the other side of the glass as the imposter lived his life. Lena never suspected. His coworkers never noticed. The creature had taken everything. And Ethan? Ethan was nothing but an echo now. Then, one night, Lena left the room. The imposter turned to the mirror, and it picked up Ethan's phone, dialed a number, and waited. 3:33 a.m. Somewhere, on another phone, someone answered. And from the speaker, a voice, asterisk, a familiar voice, asterisk, spoke its first words. "The delay is at 10 seconds. Let's begin." Dr. Evelyn Carter sat in her office, fingers steepled beneath her chin as she observed the woman sitting across from her. The patient, a young woman named Rebecca, wrung her hands nervously, her gaze darting toward the window as if something outside was watching. Evelyn had seen this kind of anxiety before, deep-seated trauma clawing its way to the surface. Her voice was steady, soothing. "Rebecca, take a deep breath. Tell me about the dream again." Rebecca exhaled shakily. "I was in my childhood home, but something was wrong. The rooms were stretched, distorted. And I could hear whispers, but I couldn't understand them. Then when I turned around, my mother was standing there, but her face was all wrong. Like someone else was wearing her skin." Evelyn nodded, jotting a few notes down. "It sounds like a manifestation of repressed memories. Sometimes the mind alters painful experiences in our dreams." "You mentioned last session that your mother, she wasn't there," Rebecca interrupted. "I mean she was. But not really. It wasn't her." Before Evelyn could respond, something strange happened. A whisper, soft and fleeting, echoed through her mind. "She's lying." Evelyn froze, her pen hovering over the notepad. The voice was distant, like an intrusive thought, but it had a distinct presence, as if it didn't belong to her at all. She glanced up at Rebecca, who was still staring at her hands. Evelyn hesitated before speaking again. "You feel like your mother was replaced?" Rebecca nodded. "Yes, exactly. But everyone kept telling me I was crazy. I know what I saw." The whisper returned. This time it was clearer. "She remembers more than she's saying." A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. She shook her head slightly as if trying to dispel the intrusive thought. It wasn't real. She was just tired. Overworked. She finished the session without further incident, but as soon as Rebecca left, Evelyn leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. What the hell was that? The whisper had felt too vivid, too external. She took a deep breath, brushing it off. It's just stress. But the next session would prove it wasn't. The next day, Evelyn met with another patient, Mr. Holloway. A man in his 60s, he had suffered from depression for years after his wife's death. As he spoke about his loneliness, Evelyn felt a strange pull in her thoughts. He keeps a picture of her under his pillow, the whisper murmured. Evelyn inhaled sharply. It had returned. She forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. How have you been sleeping, Mr. Holloway? Not well, he admitted, rubbing his temple. I wake up feeling like she's still there. It's silly, but I keep her picture under my pillow. Evelyn's heart pounded. Told you. The voice sounded smug. She clenched her fists beneath the desk. No. This wasn't possible. This wasn't normal. For the next week, the voices came more frequently. They whispered secrets about her patients, things she couldn't possibly know. At first, she used them to help guide her therapy sessions, revealing repressed memories her patients had buried deep. But as the days passed, the whispers changed. They weren't just about her patients anymore. They started talking about her. Evelyn sat in the dim glow of her office lamp, reviewing her notes. Her patients' confessions had begun to blur together, their voices an echo in her mind. But it wasn't their words that haunted her. It was the other voice, the one only she could hear. They're hiding things. It was always there now, lurking at the edges of her consciousness, slipping into her thoughts like a parasite. The first few times she dismissed it as stress, exhaustion. But the whispers grew stronger, more insistent. And worst of all, they were always right. Like today with Mr. Holloway. He keeps a picture under his pillow. How had she known? The logical answer was that she hadn't, something else had. Evelyn shuddered. She pushed the thought away, determined to distract herself. Standing, she made her way to the office bathroom and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked up, her reflection seemed off. Her features were the same, but her expression looked delayed, as if her reflection had taken a second too long to mimic her movements. She exhaled sharply and turned away. It was just her imagination. But the whispers had other plans. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? She froze mid-step. The voice wasn't external, it was in her head, yet it wasn't hers. You're not as in control as you think. Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. No, this is stress. Just stress. But as she left the office that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. It started with her mother's voice. Evelyn had been brushing her teeth when she heard it, soft but unmistakable. Evelyn, sweetheart? Her stomach clenched. Her mother had been dead for 10 years. The toothbrush slipped from her fingers, clattering into the sink. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she turned, half expecting to see the familiar figure of her mother standing behind her. But there was no one. Just the empty, shadowed hallway stretching beyond the bathroom door. You need to remember. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. She gripped the sink, forcing herself to breathe. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then the memory started. Fragments of her childhood that she hadn't thought about in years. The sound of laughter. The scent of rain against the earth. A voice, a boy's voice. Daniel. Her head snapped up. Where had the name come from? You know who I am. A chill licked up her spine. No. This was just exhaustion. She had spent too many nights analyzing other people's minds, and now hers was playing tricks on her. She needed rest. But deep down, she knew the voices were not done with her yet. Evelyn started losing time. It began with small things. She would wake up in different rooms than where she'd fallen asleep. Her notes would be written in handwriting that didn't quite look like hers. Sometimes she would glance at her reflection only to find it watching her a second too late. Then the objects started moving. Her keys would vanish from the counter only to appear in the freezer. Books shifted positions on her shelves. And the whispers? They were no longer confined to her mind. She could hear them in the walls. You're close now. It's almost time. Time for what? Evelyn tried to resist, but the whispers became commands. One day, she found herself standing in front of a filing cabinet in her office, unsure how she had gotten there. The drawer was already open. Inside was a patient file with her name on it. Her stomach twisted as she pulled it out. It was old, the edges yellowed with time. She flipped through the pages, scanning the neatly typed notes. Patient exhibits dissociative symptoms. Repressed trauma suspected. Mentions an imaginary twin named Daniel. Her breath hitched. Twin? She had no twin. But the voices laughed. That's what you think. Evelyn couldn't escape it anymore. Daniel. The name haunted her. The whispers grew more frantic, overlapping, filling her mind with fragments of a past she didn't remember. And then the nightmares began. She was a child again, running through a house that felt both familiar and foreign. The walls stretched impossibly high, and every door she opened led her back to the same dark hallway. Then the basement door. Something was behind it. She reached for the handle, but before she could open it, a voice screamed, "Don't remember." Evelyn woke up drenched in sweat. But she did remember. Daniel. Her brother. She had a brother. And something terrible had happened to him. Evelyn dug through old records, newspaper clippings, anything she could find. Her childhood home. An incident. A missing persons report. She found it. A faded newspaper article. Local boy missing, search called off. Daniel Carter, age 7, was last seen playing in his family's basement before disappearing without a trace. Despite extensive searches, no evidence of his whereabouts was found. Authorities suspect an accident, though the body was never recovered. Evelyn's hands trembled. The whispers roared in her mind. You know where he is. She drove to her childhood home. The house had been abandoned for years, its windows dark, the porch sagging under the weight of time. But the basement door was still there. Evelyn forced it open. The air was thick, stale. Dust floated in the dim light. And then she saw it. The wall. There were scratches in the wood. Tiny fingernail marks. Evelyn fell to her knees, sobs racking her body. She remembered. She had locked Daniel inside. And then she had forgotten him. Or rather, she had been made to forget. The voices had buried the truth. But now they had led her back. She broke through the wall. The skeleton was there. Small. Curled in on itself. Her mind fractured. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were his voice. You left me. You let me die. She screamed. Evelyn stumbled to her feet. She turned to leave, but something caught her eye. The mirror in the corner. Her reflection was smiling. And when she opened her mouth to scream, Daniel's voice came out. The voices knew too much. And now they owned her. John Carter had always been a creature of habit. Wake up at 7 a.m., shower, breakfast, usually just coffee and toast, then the long, dull ride to his office job at a marketing firm. By 9 a.m., he was at his desk, typing out reports that no one would read. At 6 p.m., he took the same bus home, made dinner, often frozen meals, and spent the evening watching whatever Netflix recommended. Life was simple, monotonous but safe. John didn't have many close friends. He had coworkers he made small talk with, an ex-girlfriend he hadn't spoken to in 2 years, and a mother who lived 3 hours away in a quiet retirement home. And that was fine. John liked solitude. Or at least, he thought he did. Until the first message arrived. It was a Tuesday night, just past 11:45 p.m. John was lying on his couch, scrolling through his phone, half watching a true crime documentary. The only sound was the soft hum of the television and the occasional creak of the old apartment building. Then his phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. Hey John, it's been a long time. Remember me? Elliot. John frowned. Elliot? The name meant nothing to him. He checked the number, no caller ID. Probably spam. He ignored it. A few minutes later, another message. I was starting to think you forgot me. John felt an uneasy chill crawl up his spine. It was probably some prank, but something about the wording, something about the certainty in those words unsettled him. He typed a quick reply. Sorry, I think you have the wrong number. Almost instantly, a response. Come on, Johnny. We were best friends. Don't tell me you don't remember me. John's breath hitched. Johnny. Nobody had called him that since he was a kid. He hesitated before typing. I think you have me confused with someone else. I don't know any Elliot. A long pause. The 3 dots of a typing indicator appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Then finally, you will. John tried to brush it off, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes, things he didn't fully understand. A blurry playground, the sound of children laughing. Someone standing behind him, just out of sight. A whisper. "You promised." John woke up gasping. His heart pounded in his chest. What the hell was that? He shook it off and got up for work. It was just a dream. Just his mind playing tricks on him. Except it wasn't. Over the next few days, more messages came. "Do you remember the park? We always played near the swings." "What about the treehouse? You used to say it was our secret fort." "I remember everything, John. Why don't you?" John couldn't ignore it anymore. These weren't just random texts. Whoever was sending them knew too much. But none of it made sense. John had grown up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but he had no memory of playing in any treehouse. He had friends, sure, but no one named Elliot. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more wrong it all felt. Like there was something missing. John decided to check his childhood photos. That Friday night, he drove to his mother's house. She greeted him warmly, surprised by his sudden visit. After some small talk, he finally asked, "Mom, did I have a friend named Elliot when I was a kid?" Her smile faltered. Her eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. I don't think so, honey," she said carefully. John wasn't sure why, but that hesitation unnerved him. She let him go through the old photo albums. He flipped through pages of childhood memories, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school events. Nothing. No Elliot. But then, in one photo, something caught his eye. It was a picture of him at 6 years old, playing in the backyard. The photo was faded, a little blurry. He was smiling at the camera, but in the background, near the tree, there was someone else. A small figure, barely visible. John felt a tight knot form in his stomach. He squinted, trying to make it out, but the face was too blurred. Had he always been there? Or was this the first time John had ever noticed? John took a picture of the photo with his phone and went home. That night, another text came. "See? I told you I was real." John's stomach dropped. The text was followed by an image attachment. A new photo. It was that same childhood picture, but this time, the blurry figure in the background was clear. A pale-faced boy with dark, hollow eyes. And a grin too wide to be human. "You promised." John Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the photo on his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he zoomed in on the grinning boy in the background. Elliot. He had no memory of him. None. But the photo proved he existed. John felt like he was standing at the edge of a deep, dark hole, and with each passing day, he was slipping further inside. His sleep became restless. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard faint whispers. "You promised, Johnny." When he turned over at night, he swore he felt the bed shift, as if someone else was there. Determined to find the truth, John started searching. He called his childhood friends, those he was still in contact with. "Elliot? No, man. I don't remember anyone named Elliot." Every answer was the same. Nobody remembered him. Even when John sent the photo, his friends saw nothing strange. "What are you talking about? It's just you in the backyard." John stared at his phone in disbelief. The boy was gone. He scrolled back to the original version he saved 3 nights ago. There he was, Elliot standing behind him, grinning. John's breath hitched. Why couldn't they see him? John barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of a faceless boy standing at the foot of his bed, whispering the same words. "You promised you wouldn't forget me." The whispers grew louder, more urgent. One night, he awoke to find his phone screen on, illuminating his dark room. A new message. "I'm getting closer." His heart slammed against his ribs. The air in the apartment felt thicker. Wrong. He turned over in bed, his breath catching as his eyes landed on the mirror across the room. For a split second, he thought he saw someone standing behind him. A pale face. Dark, hollow eyes? John lunged for the light switch. The reflection was normal. Just him. Just his imagination. Right? John couldn't take it anymore. He needed real answers. He drove back to his mother's house the next day. She seemed tense when she saw him. "Mom," he said, sitting at the kitchen table. "I need you to be honest with me. Was there an Elliot?" His mother's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. John, she hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. You were a lonely child. You had an imaginary friend. His stomach dropped. Imaginary? She continued, voice low. You used to talk about Elliot all the time, but then you stopped. And I never brought it up again because you were happier without him. Why was I scared of him? John's voice was barely above a whisper. His mother exhaled shakily. You used to wake up screaming in the middle of the night. You'd say, Elliot is coming. He wants me to play his game. A shiver crawled up John's spine. What game? She shook her head. You never told me. And one day you stopped talking about him. Like he never existed. John's pulse pounded in his ears. His mother reached for his hand, her eyes filled with concern. Honey, are you seeing him again? John forced a smile. No. Just remembering. He left soon after. But in his car, his hands trembled. He wasn't seeing Elliot again. Elliot was seeing him. That night, John sat on his couch, staring at the photo. Elliot's face had changed. His grin was wider now. Too wide. His eyes were staring directly at John. John's breath turned shallow. His hands shook as he locked his phone. And then his phone buzzed. A new message. From Elliot. You're starting to remember. Good. John threw his phone across the room. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But deep down he knew. Elliot was real. And he was getting closer. John had one last option. Hypnosis. Maybe his mind had locked something away, something it refused to let him see. He found a hypnotherapist the next day. An older man with a calm voice and a small, dimly lit office. John sat in the reclined chair, heart racing as the therapist spoke softly. Relax. Close your eyes. Let your mind take you back, darkness. Then a faint giggle. Leaves crunching beneath small feet. A treehouse. John saw himself, 6 years old, standing in a clearing with another boy. Elliot. He looked pale. Sickly. But his grin was wide. Let's play a game, Johnny. John, as a child, hesitated. What game? The same one we always play. Suddenly, the memory distorted. The sky darkened. The trees stretched unnaturally high. A third child appeared. John's real best friend. A boy named Daniel. He looked scared. John, I don't want to do this. Elliot grinned wider. It's too late. Then screaming. A fall. John saw Daniel's body hitting the ground below the treehouse. Blood. Then silence. Little John's face was frozen in shock. Elliot whispered, now you'll never forget me. The memory snapped. John bolted upright, gasping for air. The therapist leaned forward. John, what did you see? John's hands trembled. His childhood friend hadn't just disappeared. Daniel had died. And Elliot. Elliot was never real. He was John's guilt. His mind had created him to cope with the trauma. And now Elliot was back. And he was angry. John left the hypnotherapist's office in a daze. His mind buzzed with fear, confusion, and something worse. As he entered his apartment, the lights flickered. The air felt thick. His phone buzzed. A new text. Now you remember. John's stomach dropped. His eyes flicked to the mirror across the room. Elliot was standing behind him. His face wasn't blurry anymore. John's chest tightened. He turned around, nothing. Just an empty room. Then a sharp pain on his arm. He looked down. A word had been carved into his skin, deep, red, and fresh. You promised. John didn't remember falling asleep. But when he opened his eyes, the room was different. The lamp on his nightstand was on, though he was sure he had turned it off. His phone sat beside him. The screen glowed, showing a new message. You promised you wouldn't forget me. Now I remember everything. John's chest tightened. He didn't remember writing that message. Had he? He looked down at his arm. The deep, raw letters you promised were still there. The wound burned, but something was worse. The blood was fresh. Had he cut himself again? John grabbed his phone and checked the call logs, texts, anything that could tell him what happened last night. But there was nothing. No timestamps. No messages sent. Yet the phone screen still glowed with the last text. His own words staring back at him. Now I remember everything. John's hands trembled. He whispered to himself. No, I don't. John avoided mirrors. He didn't know why, but they felt wrong. like something was waiting for him in the reflection. That night, as he brushed his teeth, he kept his eyes down. But when he turned to leave, he saw it. Not his reflection, but Elliot, standing inside the mirror, grinning. John froze. Elliot's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, a whisper echoed inside his mind. "Let's play another game, Johnny." John stumbled back. The mirror shattered not from impact, but as if the glass itself recoiled from his fear. He ran out of the bathroom, heart pounding. But as he turned off the lights and climbed into bed, he knew Elliot wasn't just in the mirror anymore. Elliot was everywhere. Desperate, John searched online for news from his childhood. Somewhere, there had to be proof of what happened. And then he found it. A decades-old missing persons report. Daniel Graves, age 6, last seen. Near Oak Ridge Park, status. Never found. John's blood ran cold. Daniel hadn't died that night. He had disappeared. Or rather, John had forgotten. Elliot's voice slithered through his mind. "Now you remember, Johnny." John barely ate. He barely slept. When he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face the way he looked before he vanished. And he saw Elliot smiling. One night, John heard scratching at his door. Slow, deliberate. He stayed frozen under the covers. The scratching stopped. Then a whisper, "Come out and play, Johnny." John squeezed his eyes shut. He wouldn't look. He wouldn't. But when he finally opened them, Elliot was standing at the foot of his bed, smiling. John couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Then Elliot tilted his head and whispered, "Now it's your turn to disappear." John ran. Out of his apartment, out into the streets, barefoot, not caring who saw him. He had one last place to go. The abandoned house from his memories. It still stood on the edge of town, hidden behind trees. John stepped inside. Dust covered the floor. And then a giggle echoed through the empty space. "Welcome back, Johnny." John turned. The air was thick with memories. And then he saw the treehouse outside. Just like before. Elliot stood beneath it, his grin wider than ever. John knew what he had to do. He climbed. Step by step. The wooden planks creaked under his weight, just like they had all those years ago. And at the top, a small, skeletal hand reached for him. John gasped. Daniel's body was still here, buried beneath the floorboards. Forgotten. Elliot stood beside him, whispering, "I helped you forget, but now you remember." John collapsed to his knees. The weight of the truth crushed him. Elliot crouched beside him. And now, it's time to finish the game. The world faded to black. Days later, John Carter was officially reported missing. His apartment remained untouched, the only clue left behind. A message scrawled on his bathroom mirror, written in John's own blood, "I remember now." The police found no leads, no evidence. It was as if John had simply disappeared, just like Daniel. And just like before, the world moved on. People forgot. But somewhere, in the dark corners of forgotten childhood memories, a voice still whispered, "You promised, Johnny." John's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he thought he was in bed. But then, he felt the damp wooden floor beneath him. The smell of decay filled his nostrils. He tried to sit up, but something was holding him down. Ropes. Tightly bound. His heart pounded as he struggled, twisting against the restraints. His wrists burned. A voice echoed in the darkness. "No use fighting, Johnny." John froze. It was Elliot, but he couldn't see him. Just darkness. And then a match flickered to life. The flame illuminated a small, windowless room. Wooden walls, dust, and rotting floorboards. John's breath hitched. He was inside the treehouse. Elliot crouched in front of him, his grin impossibly wide. "It took a long time, but you finally came back," Elliot whispered. John shook his head, panic rising in his throat. "This isn't real. This isn't real." Elliot tilted his head. "Oh, but it is." He held out his hand, and John saw what he was holding. A small, cracked skull. Daniel's. John's stomach churned. Memories flooded back, the screams. The fall. The way Daniel's had hit the ground. John squeezed his eyes shut. "No, I didn't, you did." Elliot's voice was soft, patient. "And you promised you wouldn't forget." The room tilted. John's head throbbed. His vision blurred. Elliot's face twisted into something inhuman, his smile stretching, eyes turning into black voids. "One last game, Johnny." John screamed as the floor beneath him split open. Hands, small, rotting hands, reached up from the darkness, clawing at him. They dragged him down. Deeper, deeper, until silence. Days later, the landlord knocked on John's apartment door. No answer. After 3 days of complaints about a rotten smell, he unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything looked normal, except for one thing: the bathroom mirror. Words were scratched into the glass. "Now we can play forever." The landlord shuddered. He turned, and for a brief second, he swore he saw a shadow move in the mirror. A figure. A boy with hollow eyes and a grin too wide. And then it was gone. John Carter's disappearance became just another unsolved case. People talked about it for a while, and then they forgot. Just like they forgot Daniel. Just like they forgot Elliot. But somewhere, in an empty treehouse where time stood still, a voice still whispered, "You promised, Johnny. And you can never leave." Did Elliot consume John? Was Elliot real? Or was he simply John's guilt taking form? The horror is in the forgetting Elliot isn't a ghost, but a curse that erases its victims from existence. The final twist suggests Elliot will find someone new and the cycle will continue. Don't forget to tell your horror experience in comment. Subscribe our channels for more scary and horror stories.